My first knitting machine was a Brother 910 standard gauge knitting machine, and I managed to talk the seller down to $700 for the bundle, and it was worth about twice that. My second knitting machine is a Brother 270 bulky electronic knitting machine. I got it for free. It should have been worth a few $1,000s. Don't worry, I will tell you how to do this. It is the end times, and it is pouring. My friends the next town over have already lost power today because it's a massive storm here in California, and California can't handle the weather. It's stormy, and the lighting is terrible, but we're gonna deal. This is gonna be a long video, so grab a cup of tea and get ready for the long haul. There's a lot of information here. I've put links to a lot of it in the description below, but I recommend you watch the whole video before you jump into shopping. This video is structured from easiest to hardest to acquire, which also happens to correlate with most expensive to least expensive. And if you stick around till the end, I'll tell you how I got one of my knitting machines for free and how you can do it too. When I decided that I wanted a knitting machine, I did months of research. And then when I decided I wanted my second knitting machine, I did months of research. So let me share all of that experience with y'all and see if I can't help you find a knitting machine. The big caveat here is that I'm in the US, so all of this information is US-centric. There are a few things in here that have international options. I will point those out when they come up. First, let's talk about knitting machines. Machine knitting is a different hobby than hand knitting. Some of the skills will transfer, like how to construct garments that are knit flat and how to assemble them, but most of it's going to be new, and the learning curve is steep. Be prepared to put time and energy into learning how to use your new machine. We should also define what I'm talking about when I say knitting machine. If you're here looking for one of the Centro or the Addi machines, I like to call them the beanie machines because they make hats. Just go buy one of those. They are plastic, they don't hold up very well, and people like to hook them up to drills, so you don't know what kind of shape a secondhand machine is going to be in. So I recommend just going to the manufacturer or to Amazon and buying one of those. There are links to those in the description. When I talk about knitting machines, I'm talking about flatbed knitting machines, like the one behind me here. They're about the size of a piano keyboard, and they can weigh anywhere from like 20 to 50 pounds, I'd say. When you've decided you want a knitting machine, you should think about what you actually want to make, because there are lots of different things that knitting machines can do, and you'll need to be able to find a machine that does the things that you want to do. Most of the things you can do with a knitting machine can be done with hand manipulation. That involves picking up stitches, moving them around, reforming knit stitches into purl stitches, and similar things. It is easier to do these things with a patterning machine, but you can absolutely do all of this with a standard machine that doesn't do any patterning. The only thing that you really need a patterning machine for is when you get up to more than 2 colors. If you want to do 3 and 4 color work, you absolutely need a double bed machine that does some kind of patterning. You'll probably want electronic, but you can do it with punch card machines. A ribber is a second bed. The knitting machine itself is just the top bed. It can only make knit stitches. With a ribber attachment, you can turn a knitting machine into a double bed knitting machine. And that means it can make knit and purl stitches. It's called a ribber because it's commonly used for ribbing, but it's also used for doing complicated color work. It's not a requirement, but it is always nice to have. It makes things a little faster. Like I said earlier, machine knitting is a different hobby than hand knitting. Anything you can do on a knitting machine, you can do by hand, but not everything you can do by hand can you do on a knitting machine. The standard set of features are 2-color Fair Isle, lace, ribbing, tuck and slip, weaving patterns, plaiting, and intarsia. Patterning machines can do 2- and 3-color jacquard, and if you want to make fancy baby blankets with interesting knit and purl patterns, you can either do that with hand manipulation or with an accessory called a garter carriage that you will need to use with a patterning machine. There are 2 main kinds of patterning. There are punch cards and there are electronic machines. Punch cards are mechanical and they are beautiful, and the machinery, like the way that they work, is really cool. And I highly encourage you to go watch this video that a friend of mine put together about how the internals of the Brother knitting machines work. The electronic machines Some of them can be hooked up to computers. Some of them you program with a push-button interface that is a little old because these machines tend to be a little old. There's also AYAB, which is the software that I work with. If you're interested in AYAB, go check out their website and look at the set of machines that they support, and then you'll have to pick from one of those. So that's basic functionality of a knitting machine. Figure out what you want to make. Like if you want to make plain sweaters, you don't need a fancy machine. You can get away with one that doesn't have any patterning functionality. If you want to make 3 and 4 color jacquard knit designs, then cut and sew and turn those into interesting dresses, you'll need a patterning machine. Once you've decided on plain, punch card, or electronic, now you need to figure out what gauge you want. With knitting needles, to use different sized yarns, you need different sized needles. It's very similar with knitting machines. There are 3 gauges. The gauge refers to how far apart the needles are, and that determines what thickness of yarn you can use. Standard gauge machines work with yarn weights 0 and 1. Mid-gauge work with yarn weights 2 and 3, and bulky work with yarn weights 4 and 5. This is just a starting point. You can use slightly thicker and definitely thinner yarns on these different machines, but this is where it starts. If you want to be able to just go to the craft store and buy yarn to make things with, you want a mid-gauge or a bulky. Getting the yarn for the standard gauge machines is a little more effort because it's not as common in the stores these days. If you want to do any Instagramming or TikToking or YouTube, I recommend getting a bulky or a mid-gauge machine. Larger things are easier to film, and with the larger yarns, the projects go faster. But standard gauge machines are better for lace. The bulky and the mid-gauge don't really do lace in the same way. The standard gauge machines generally do like transfer lace. They make eyelets, and they can do that in an automated way. Standard gauge machines are a lot more common, so they're going to be cheaper. It's a trade-off that you need to make. You just need to think about what you really want. Those are your options when it comes to knitting machines. Now, let's talk about how to actually purchase them. So we're going to do this in easiest to hardest to find, and that happens to correlate with most expensive to least expensive. The main company that's still manufacturing knitting machines and selling them on the market is Silver Reed. Their workhorse is the LK150. It's a mid-gauge machine. It's a plastic bed machine, but I have heard that they last for decades at a time. Very popular with beginners. It doesn't do any patterning, and it doesn't have a ribber, but you can still do a lot with this machine. It should cost you about $500. There's a link to the Silver Reed machines in the description. If you decide you want an LK150, check out Creative TN. She worked with this machine a lot, and she's got a lot of interesting videos and beginner setup. Silver Reed also makes the SK280, which is a standard gauge machine. It's a punch card machine, and it'll run you about $1,000 with the ribber and extra $700. They have the SK840, which is a standard gauge electronic machine. It'll run you about $1,500, and it uses the same ribber as the punch card machine. And then they have the SK155, which is a bulky punch card machine, and it's about $1,200. It has a ribber, but the ribber is hard to find. There are a few lesser known brands that are making consumer machines. Please do your research before buying from them. I would recommend going with Silver Reed because they are so well known, and you can get them serviced and you can get extra parts for them, but there are other options out there. The next machine that is still being manufactured is the Knitterate. Knitterate holds a special place in my heart. It started out as a Kickstarter project, an attempt to make a fully open source knitting machine. They didn't quite make it there, but they did wind up manufacturing them. It has a bunch of custom software. It is on the verge of being an industrial machine. It's not quite a consumer machine. It's more geared towards makerspaces and small businesses. I've been digging through their forums, and it sounds like they have a low-level language. And I'm just like looking at this and I'm like, oh my God, I could write a sweater compiler, like a real sweater compiler. My own high-level domain-specific language to describe garments and sweaters and compile that down into the individual machine language that they're using and then like have a real sweater compiler. I want one. I really want one. It's $15,000. I cannot justify the price. Maybe someday. Those are the machines that are still on the market. It might be tempting to go out and just purchase one of these because you can absolutely do that and it'll show up at your house in however many days. But before you buy a knitting machine, the first thing that you should do Tell your friends and family that you're thinking about getting a knitting machine. Ask if anyone has worked with one, because the old knitting machines are a lot like sewing machines in that they're metal, and if they're well maintained and taken care of, they will outlive us all. And also, like sewing machines, you may know someone who has one in their basement or their attic that they're not using anymore. A free machine, or one that comes with friends and family discount, from someone who knows how to use it and may be able to help you get started, is always going to be a better option than something you buy on the internet. Something else you should do is find your local machine knitting guild. Ask if they have a buy and sell mailing list, which they probably do. See if you can attend a meeting as a guest. These people know what they're doing and they'll be able to help you get started and help you learn new things. Now we're going to talk about the secondary markets. Knitting machines hit the height of their popularity in the 70s and the 80s, but they were largely phased out in the 90s as commercial knitwear became more viable. So there were many brands and there were many manufacturers. Not everything is in English. A lot of these machines came out of Japan. If you find a machine that looks appealing, it looks like it does the things that you need it to do, go find the manual. There's a website in the description that has PDFs of all of the manuals, of most of the manuals to these old knitting machines. They have a lot of information about how to get started with the machine. They'll also tell you what kinds of things it can do and what should be in the box with it so that you know what you're getting into. When you find the knitting machine that you want, make sure that you can find at least replacement needles and a sponge bar. Those are really the only things that will need to be replaced on these machines. The needles tend to bend and break with a lot of usage, and the sponge bars wear out over time. But there are lots of sellers. Check eBay, check Etsy. That's a good place to start. If it's your first machine, make sure it works before you buy it. Ask the seller to demonstrate in a video, or if you're going to get it in person, see it working before you buy it. If you're buying from a dealer, you're probably fine because they theoretically have serviced it. The learning curve is steep, so you don't want to be wondering as you're getting started if the problem is you or the problem is the machine, so make sure it works before you buy it. If you are mechanically inclined, you can service and repair your own machines. That same website that has the manuals also has the service manuals, so you can go through and learn a lot about how they're supposed to work and how to debug common problems. Also, check out The Answer Lady on YouTube. She and her husband refurbish old machines, so she has a lot of interesting videos about how to disassemble and clean and repair a bunch of different kinds of knitting machines. The PASUP caveat. PASUP decided they needed to be different. The machines aren't a standard gauge, they are slightly different, so none of the tools for one of the standard gauges will work for a PASUP. They are technology heavy, they are physically heavy, and they are very expensive because they were kind of geared towards small businesses. I wouldn't recommend a PASUP as a starter machine unless you have somebody who already knows how to use it and can help you get started, because they are so very different from everything else on the market. If you decided on a secondhand machine, the easiest option is eBay. You can probably get exactly what you want, and eBay has a bunch of systems in place to make sure that everything is above board. Like if the seller is misrepresenting the machine, you can always leave feedback and find ways to resolve disputes about payment and all of those things. That's really helpful. But shipping is going to be expensive. These things are heavy. But there are international options. There are a lot of sellers in China and Japan, and you can get things shipped all over the world. The other option is Facebook. There are specific groups for buying and selling knitting machines, which also have international options. Prices are going to vary widely, and shipping options are going to be pretty interesting. Most people are looking for local pickup. When people give up machine knitting, they tend to give it up all at once, which means that you can find bundles. But the people who list things on eBay and who are on the knitting machine buy and sell groups on Facebook tend to know what they have, and they tend to break up those bundles and sell things individually because they know that they'll make more money that way. Those things will be more expensive. There are occasionally machines for sale on Etsy, but they don't come up very often. Classifieds are where you're going to find the best deals. On the internet, that's going to be Craigslist. Go to your local Craigslist, set up a saved search for knitting machine, and then stay on top of those emails. When you set up a saved search on Craigslist, it will email you every time somebody lists something that's within your search terms. As long as you stay on top of those emails, you should be in good shape. Also keep an eye out for estate sales and people selling off their entire yarn stash. Those get interesting. If you do wind up buying a machine from Craigslist, stay safe. Meet the seller in a public place, bring a friend if you can, and if a deal sounds too good to be true, it probably is. That is how you buy a knitting machine. Let me walk you through my 2 case studies. When I bought my first knitting machine, I knew that I wanted to work with a YAB, so I was looking for a machine that was supported by the software and the hardware. I did a bunch of research. I asked around to make sure that I would be able to learn how to machine knit on my own and it wasn't going to be too big a hassle. And I figured out that I would be able to. I watched all the YouTube videos. I think I watched most of the Answer Ladies stuff. And then I found a bundle on Craigslist that was one of the machines that was supported by the software that I wanted to use. And I got a video from the seller of it working, and then I negotiated the price down a few $100s. And then I took a friend and I met the seller in a parking lot in a public place, and we exchanged machine and money, and I brought it home and I got it set up and I got working. For the 270, I knew that I wanted specifically the 270 because it has partial support in a YAB, and it would be a fun project for me to get it fully up and running, but they're very rare and they're very expensive. So I did my research, I looked everywhere. I was considering just buying one from eBay. It was in Japanese, but I figured I could take a label maker and just label over the things that I couldn't understand with their English translations. But I was concerned that it would have different power requirements because it wasn't American, and I was like doing a bunch of research to try to figure out if I could make it work with like some kind of converter and if it would have any problems. But in that time, I set up a saved search on Craigslist, and I got one in my inbox, and I jumped right away because it was free. It was free, and I was like prepared to spend a few $1,000s on this thing. It wasn't in good shape. It needed to be deep cleaned. It needed to have its sponge bars replaced, and it was missing a few tools and parts, but it only took a few $100s to get it up and running. It was absolutely worth the time and effort. So that's how I got my knitting machines. And that's like the end of my notes. Some people might ask why I'm doing this, especially like encouraging people to go off and TikTok and Instagram and YouTube these things, like creating competition for myself here on YouTube. But that's not the way that I think about it. Sometimes it feels like machine knitting is a dying hobby. I go to the local meetup and I'm the youngest person there by about 20 years. And I know that these things aren't manufactured much anymore, but it is an interesting and like creatively fulfilling hobby. And I know that by creating more machine knitters, by helping y'all find knitting machines, it will make life better for all of us, because when more people join this hobby, it will create more demand for services and parts and patterns, and that will create a market for these things, and then we will get more of all of this. And by encouraging y'all to join TikTok and YouTube and all of these things, like, it'll create more of a community, and we will all do better together. So go forth, find your knitting machine, let me know how it goes. When you do find a machine, check out my beginner-friendly tutorials and make some interesting things. Those of y'all who already have machines and maybe are thinking about getting a second one, let me know how you got your machine and if I'm missing any resources here. Happy knitting! I just wanna da da da. I need my tea as a prop because it's just the way things are. All right, we're gonna do this.